She was a lovely woman, was my mother, when my father was alive. It never was really the same after.
This is the story of how Alzheimer's disease forced Margot Bryant out of Coronation Street at 79, and the shocking revelations that came 12 years later about who she really was. The beloved actress, who played timid Minnie Caldwell for 16 years, didn't choose to leave in 1976. Her memory failed so severely that she had to read her final lines off props placed around the set. But the real bombshell came after her death in '88, when her co-stars finally spoke the truth. Margot Bryant was nothing like the meek character Britain adored. Betty Driver put it bluntly: she swore like a trooper and was more like Ina Sharples than Minnie Caldwell.
I like Christmas.
Why?
It reminds me.
Well, why's Alveda never been anywhere near? That's what I'd like to know. Oh.
Born on the 8th of March, 1897, in Hull, Yorkshire, Kathleen Mary Margaret Bryant came from a medical family. Her father, Dr. William Arthur Bryant, ran a general practice that attracted every stray cat in the neighborhood, a detail that would prove rather prophetic for his daughter's most famous role. Before Coronation Street made her a household name, Margot enjoyed quite the theatrical career, dancing in Fred Astaire's West End show at the Queen's Theatre back in '23, where she performed alongside Fred and his sister Adele in a production called Stop Flirting. Radio work in Mrs. Dale's Diary followed, along with film roles opposite some notable names: Thora Hird in The Cure for Love, and even Oliver Reed and Adam Faith in Beat Girl just before Coronation Street began.
Come on, let's pull our crackers and then we can wear paper hats and all.
What for? Fun.
When Granada Television started casting for their new twice-weekly serial in 1960, roughly 600 actors competed for 23 roles, and Margot secured the part of Minnie Caldwell. Episode 2 on the 14th of December, 1960 marked her first appearance. And here's a telling story about the woman herself. Doris Speed later recalled that after recording that second episode, Margot was in floods of tears because she genuinely believed there was no regular part for her and that she was being let go. The tears weren't about losing the work. They were about losing what she recognized as a lucrative role, and Margot Bryant understood the value of steady employment in television. As it turned out, she needn't have worried. 16 years and roughly 987 episodes later, she'd become one of the show's most recognizable faces.
Oh, I suppose it could be one of them sixpences.
Sixpences?
What defined Minnie Caldwell more than anything was her membership in what became known as the Snug Trio, and alongside Ina Sharples, played by Violet Carson, and Martha Longhurst, played by Lynn Carroll, these three elderly women became the heart of early Coronation Street. Creator Tony Warren explained the dynamic perfectly. Whenever you had tough old viragos like Ina, they always had henchmen, and they generally had a talkative one that could be shouted down. Plus, there was always a silent one who nodded but was a bit rebellious. Minnie filled that role, the silent, slightly rebellious one who took Ina's lectures with a mixture of obedience and quiet resistance. Evenings in the Rover's Returns snug bar became their territory, where they nursed their milk stouts, shared gossip, and generally put the world to rights. Minnie's own assessment of her relationship with Ina was characteristically understated when she admitted, "She bullies me, she always has, in the name of Christianity." Decades of familiarity, mutual dependence, and a healthy dose of exasperation built that friendship into something Britain couldn't get enough of.
Shall I tell you about the surprise?
What? Christmas Day and the outpatients?
May of '64 brought devastation when Martha Longhurst died of a heart attack in the Snug, and the trio became a duo. Both Minnie and Ina were left reeling from the loss, and the dynamic between the two remaining friends shifted considerably. Without Martha as a buffer, Minnie bore the full force of Ina's domineering personality, which meant their relationship became even more central to both their storylines. But Minnie's life wasn't all about Ina's lectures, and several other relationships shaped her storylines over the years. Jed Stone, the lovable rogue, played by Kenneth Cope, lodged with her in 62, 63, and again in 66, calling her Ma while she nicknamed him Sonny Jim, and he became the son she never had. Bobby, her ginger tomcat, appeared for roughly 15 years, though the role was actually played by several cats over the years, including Margot's own marmalade Tom, named Toby. That cat became as much a part of Minnie's identity as her hairnet and coat, inseparable from how audiences pictured her. 1974 brought an unexpected proposal when Albert Tatlock asked Minnie to marry him. Though it wasn't exactly a romantic gesture, it was for financial convenience. The engagement collapsed spectacularly when Ina mistakenly thought the proposal was for her, and Minnie discovered Albert drank his tea from a saucer, which was apparently beyond even Minnie's tolerance. But perhaps the most significant relationship was with Handel Gartside, an old-school flame who returned in 1970 after making his fortune in Quebec, and Handel would eventually become the reason for Minnie's departure from the street, though not in any way the writers originally intended. 1970 brought one of Coronation Street's most dramatic early storylines, and it placed Minnie squarely at its center when an American serviceman named Joe Donnelly lodged with her, claiming he'd been demobbed. The truth was far darker. Joe had murdered Steve Tanner over an unpaid debt and was actually a deserter, and after confessing to Irma Ogden, Joe took Minnie and Bobby hostage at gunpoint in her own home. Stan Ogden burst in and managed to convince Joe to release Minnie, taking her place as hostage instead, and what followed was psychologically harrowing. Joe forced Stan to sing Silent Night at gunpoint before the confrontation ended tragically, leaving Minnie so traumatized that Albert Tatlock took her in because she simply couldn't face returning to number 5. The trauma of having a gun pointed at you in your own front room, where you'd lived peacefully for years, doesn't simply vanish because the incident is over. And that's when the story takes its tragic turn. By early 1976, something was clearly wrong with Margot Bryant, who was 79 years old, and around March of that year began suffering severe memory loss. This wasn't the occasional forgetfulness that comes with age. This was rapid, catastrophic deterioration that made her work impossible. And what happened next shows just how dire the situation had become. Her penultimate episode required her to read lines from prompts placed on various props around the set, including her handbag, which meant a professional actress with decades of experience was reduced to reading dialogue off her handbag because she simply couldn't remember the words anymore. Episode 1589, broadcast on the 7th of April, 76, became her final appearance, and the script was placed on the cabin counter where Margot consulted it several times. And if you watch that episode now, you can actually see her picking it up as she walks out of the scene. Heartbreaking doesn't begin to cover it when you know what was happening to her. This wasn't a contract dispute, and it wasn't a salary negotiation or a creative disagreement with producers. A medical crisis was unfolding in real time, and Margot was later described as distressed by her difficulty remembering her lines as her health deteriorated. Depression followed, which often accompanies the early stages of dementia when people are still aware enough to recognize what they're losing, and the production team faced an impossible situation. The character's exit was handled quietly, almost anticlimactically, when Minnie went to visit her old friend Handel Gartside in Whaley Bridge, Derbyshire, to help keep house after his wife died. October of that year brought Handel back to Weatherfield to inform Ina that Minnie had decided to stay permanently, and that was it. No grand farewell party, no special episode, no final scene with Ina in the snug. Minnie Caldwell simply didn't come back. For a character who'd been part of the show since episode 2, it was a remarkably subdued ending. But of course, the production team had little choice because Margot's condition made any kind of planned farewell impossible. Work never came again for Margot Bryant after that final episode, and she moved to a nursing home in the Manchester area where she was formally diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Eventually, admission as an inpatient to Cheadle Royal Hospital in Heald Green, Cheshire became necessary, and for a woman who'd spent 16 years as one of Britain's most recognizable faces on television, it was a quiet, private decline into a disease that steals everything. New Year's Day, 1988, brought Margot's death at 90 years old, and her funeral took place on the 11th of January at Manchester Crematorium. Her Coronation Street family, Thelma Barlow, Eileen Derbyshire, Julie Goodyear, Barbara Knox, and William Roach, were all there to pay their respects, showing that despite everything, genuine bonds had formed during those 16 years together. 1 month later, ITV broadcast something extraordinary that would change how Britain remembered Margot Bryant forever. On the 4th of February, 1988, they aired Minnie Caldwell Remembered, a tribute to Margot Bryant, presented partly by Kenneth Cope, appearing in character as Jed Stone, and 10.8 million viewers tuned in. For half an hour, British television audiences expected a warm, nostalgic look back at their beloved Minnie Caldwell. But what they got instead was a series of revelations that completely upended everything they thought they knew about Margot Bryant. Betty Driver, who played Betty Turpin, didn't mince words when she described Margot as a little tinker who swore like a trooper, and this wasn't the gentle, timid woman who'd spent 16 years being bullied by Ina Sharples. This was someone altogether different, someone the public had never really known, someone who'd been hiding in plain sight the entire time. Lynn Carroll, who'd played Martha Longhurst, spoke honestly about the character of Margot herself, confirming that she was very different to the part the public saw. And Carroll noted that Margot could be arrogant and rude with well-wishers. Imagine that. Fans approaching the actress who played sweet Minnie Caldwell, expecting warmth and vulnerability, and instead encountering someone who might tell them exactly where to get off without a second thought. Eileen Derbyshire, who played Emily Bishop, described Margot's attitude towards children as being akin to that of W.C. Fields, which for those unfamiliar means she didn't particularly like them. Yet Derbyshire also revealed Margot's capacity for kindness when she explained how after the birth of Derbyshire's son Oliver Holt, Margot took the trouble to make a handmade shirt for him. That tribute, incidentally, contains one of only 2 known interviews Eileen Derbyshire gave during her entire time on the show, which tells you how significant the occasion was and how much Margot's passing meant to her colleagues. Doris Speed, who'd played Annie Walker, spoke of Margot's seeming arrogance and recalled the tears after episode 2, but Betty Driver added another fascinating dimension to the picture when she revealed that Doris Speed and Margot Bryant were at each other's throats all the time. Politics divided them. Doris was staunch Labour and Margot was Tory, and their backstage feuds over political differences were legendary among the cast, with neither woman backing down from their convictions. The overall assessment from Margot's colleagues was unanimous and striking. She was more like Ina Sharples than Minnie Caldwell in real life. Tough, sharp-witted, forthright, and utterly unlike the timid, indecisive character that millions of viewers adored every week. Margot Bryant had spent 16 years playing completely against type. Every time she shuffled onto screen in that old coat with Bobby in her arms, looking worried and uncertain, she was performing a role that was the polar opposite of her actual personality, and nobody watching had the slightest clue. Think about the skill that required, because to consistently portray vulnerability and timidity when your natural inclination is to be tough and outspoken, that's genuine acting talent. The irony is delicious when you consider that Britain fell in love with Minnie Caldwell precisely because she seemed so real, so authentic in her nervous uncertainty, and all along, the woman playing her was nothing of the sort. Betty Driver and her sister Frida maintained their friendship with Margot throughout her years in the nursing home, visiting regularly until her death. And despite the political clashes, despite Margot's sometimes difficult personality, genuine affection existed between the actress and her co-stars. They saw past the tough exterior to the professional underneath, the woman who'd helped create one of British television's most enduring characters. And they honored that right to the very end. 2008 brought Kenneth Cope back to Coronation Street as Jed Stone, 20 years after Margot's death and 42 years after he'd last appeared on the program. The storyline confirmed Minnie's death when Jed was shown visiting her grave, and he kept framed photographs of Minnie on his mantelpiece and had named his cat Sonny Jim after Minnie's nickname for him. Reminiscing with Emily Bishop, he mentioned his regret about being arrested on Minnie's birthday back in '66, which shows that even decades later, the character still mattered enough to give her a proper ending and a place in the show's ongoing history. 95 brought a documentary episode titled Ina, Minnie and Martha as part of the Coronation Street Character Collection, demonstrating the enduring significance of the Snug Trio and how these three women, sitting in that small room with their milk stouts, had defined an era of British television that people still remembered fondly 2 decades after Margot's departure. So what's the real story here? And what does it all mean when you step back and look at the whole picture? It's not just about an actress leaving a show because of illness, though that in itself is poignant enough to break your heart. It's about the extraordinary contrast between public perception and private reality, and how, for 16 years, Margot Bryant convinced Britain that she was Minnie Caldwell with such skill that when her co-stars finally revealed the truth after her death, it came as a genuine shock to millions. The title of this video says, Margot Bryant finally revealed the truth. But that's not quite accurate when you examine what actually happened. Margot herself never revealed anything about her departure or who she really was. She couldn't. By the time she left Coronation Street, Alzheimer's had already begun stealing her memories, her words, her ability to communicate, and the revelations came from her colleagues speaking honestly after she was gone, painting a picture of a complex woman who was talented enough to hide her true nature behind one of television's most beloved characters. Something rather sad emerges when you realize that millions knew and loved Minnie Caldwell, but relatively few knew the real Margot Bryant, the woman who swore like a trooper, who feuded with Doris Speed over politics, who could be difficult with fans, who made handmade shirts for colleagues' babies despite allegedly not liking children. That woman remained largely unknown until after her death, hidden behind a character who was her complete opposite in every conceivable way. But perhaps that's exactly as Margot would have wanted it, because she was a professional after all, and she understood that her job was to make people believe in Minnie Caldwell, not to make them love Margot Bryant. By that measure, she succeeded brilliantly, and even now, decades after her final appearance, people still talk about Minnie with genuine affection. They remember her hairnet, her cat, her perpetual anxiety about Ina's disapproval. And they remember a character, not an actress, which is the greatest compliment any performer can receive. The tragedy is that Alzheimer's robbed Margot of a proper farewell, and she deserved a final scene in the snug with Ina, a last moment with Bobby, a chance to close the door on number 5 Coronation Street, knowing she'd completed her work. Instead, she read her lines off the cabin counter and walked away, probably not fully understanding that she'd never return. And that's the cruel reality of dementia. It doesn't care about narrative satisfaction or professional closure or giving people the endings they deserve. When Margot died on New Year's Day, 88, she left behind a complicated legacy that took years for people to fully understand. Difficult, talented, nothing like the character she played, and absolutely committed to her craft. That was Margot Bryant in a nutshell, turning a supporting role in a new television serial into a 16-year career, appearing in nearly 1,000 episodes and becoming part of British cultural history. Not bad for someone who cried after episode 2 because she thought she was being let go. The next time you think about Minnie Caldwell, timid, anxious, perpetually worried Minnie, remember that the woman playing her was tough enough to survive in show business for decades, strong-minded enough to have blazing political rows with Doris Speed, and talented enough to make millions believe she was someone she absolutely wasn't. That's the real story of Margot Bryant, not the story of a gentle old lady who played a gentle old lady, but the story of a formidable actress who hid in plain sight for 16 years, swearing like a trooper when the cameras stopped rolling and being more Ina than Minnie when she thought no one was watching. And perhaps that's the truth she never got to reveal herself, but her colleagues did after she was gone. Margot Bryant was a far more interesting person than Minnie Caldwell ever was.